What's the statutory basis for a federal judge issuing an order that affects people other than the parties before the court? How can a judge, a federal judge, issue an order that affects everybody else other than those in front of him or her? How is that possible?
Senator, the Department of Justice makes that argument all the time in our briefs. I think in many cases class actions would be inappropriate. They wouldn't, the plaintiffs couldn't satisfy Rule 23 to establish a class.
So they couldn't?
Correct.
Welcome back, everyone. We need to talk about something that should send a chill down every patriot's spine. I just watched a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing where Senator John Kennedy grilled a Department of Justice nominee about these so-called universal injunctions. If you haven't heard of these, let me break it down for you. These are court orders issued by a single federal judge that don't just apply to the parties involved in a case. They apply nationwide, even universally. Think about that. One unelected judge can issue a ruling that impacts 330 million Americans. Does that sound like the America our founding fathers envisioned? I don't think so.
Mr. Shoemate, what's a universal injunction?
Senator, a universal injunction is what we call an order from a court enjoining the government in a way that goes beyond the parties to the case, but applies nationwide or in some cases universally to enjoin the government.
Is it sometimes referred to as a nationwide injunction?
Yes, it is, Senator.
Okay. What's the statutory basis for a federal judge issuing an order that affects people other than the parties before the court?
I'm not aware of a statutory basis, Senator.
There is no statutory basis, is there?
No, Senator.
What's the United States Supreme Court opinion which interprets the Constitution in a way that allows a federal district court judge to do this? Can you name me that case?
I'm not aware of one, Senator.
There isn't one, is there?
I'm not aware of one, Senator.
Now, explain to me how this works. You have a plaintiff and you have a defendant, and the plaintiff files a lawsuit and goes in front of a federal judge. Federal judge has certain jurisdiction in personam and subject matter over the parties, the people, the plaintiff and the defendant. They're the only two people in court. How can a judge, a federal judge, issue an order that affects everybody else other than those in front of him or her? How is that possible?
It shouldn't be possible, Senator, but district courts do it all the time. I think on the theory that the courts need to enjoin a federal policy from going into effect, and they often will enjoin it as nationwide, so all non-parties are protected by that injunction.
I thought that if you wanted to affect parties who aren't in court, you had to file a class action.
That's correct, Senator.
So why don't the federal judges, instead of issuing a universal injunction with no legal basis, tell the plaintiff, look, you got to go file a class action if you want to impact parties who aren't subject to my court?
Senator, the Department of Justice makes that argument all the time in our briefs. I think in many cases class actions would be inappropriate. They wouldn't, the plaintiffs couldn't satisfy Rule 23 to establish a class.
So they couldn't?
Correct.
So they prefer to ask for a universal injunction?
Yes.
Okay. Does this encourage forum shopping?
Yes, Senator. Not only does it encourage forum shopping, but also district shopping and filing multiple strategic lawsuits to find one judge that will enjoin a single policy nationwide. Where if you have 5 lawsuits, a plaintiff, only one of those 5 cases needs to be successful.
And both sides, all sides, have used this as a way to forum shop, haven't they?
I think plaintiffs, regardless of administrations, will often file cases in the most favorable forum, yes.
Okay, we've established that there's no basis in statute and no basis in Supreme Court precedent for a universal injunction. How about at common law? I mean, universal injunction is basically an equitable remedy. Did this exist in common law courts in England on which our law is based?
I don't believe so, Senator. I think the government has cited cases from the Supreme Court that says, courts are really bound by the scope of relief that a court in equity would have granted back in England before the founding, and the courts at that time would grant relief to the parties in the case, not far beyond the.
A universal injunction as a remedy is unknown in English common law, is it not?
I haven't done the research that far back, but I'm not aware of it.
I have.
Okay.
It's unknown. Wasn't part of equity. Only about 27 universal injunctions were issued in the 20th century. Does that sound about right?
That sounds about right, Senator.
But 86 of them were issued against President Trump in his first term. Is that correct?
I don't know the specific number, but they were a high number.
And so far in President Trump's second term, 30 universal injunctions have been issued against him. Have they not?
Senator, I don't have a specific number, but that sounds about right.
The universal injunction has become a weapon against the Trump administration, has it not?
Yes.
And tell me again in my last 10 seconds, tell me the basis for universal injunction in Article 3. I read Article 3, which defines judicial power. Where does it mention universal injunction?
It does not, Senator. It says courts are to decide the case or controversy before them, which is based on the parties to the case.
So the Congress could act and say, look, federal judges, you render a decision to a plaintiff or a defendant, but you can't impact people outside of your courtroom other than through a class action. That's why God created class actions, isn't it?
Yes, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, Senator Kennedy asked the nominee some rapid-fire questions, and I've got to say, the answers were disturbing. Let's start with the basics. Senator Kennedy asked, what's the statutory basis for a federal judge issuing an order that affects people who aren't even in the courtroom? The nominee admitted that there is no statutory basis. None. Zero. Zilch. That means there's no law passed by Congress that allows this. And yet, judges are doing it all the time. How is that even possible in a constitutional republic? And it gets worse. Senator Kennedy then asked if there's any Supreme Court precedent, any case law, that interprets the Constitution to allow universal injunctions. You know what the nominee said? He said, I'm not aware of one. That's right, there isn't one. So let me ask you, if there's no legal basis in our statutes and no constitutional basis in our courts, where does this power come from? I'll tell you where. It's coming out of thin air. This is judicial activism at its worst, folks. Plain and simple. Now, Senator Kennedy made a brilliant point. If you want to impact people who aren't parties to your lawsuit, you have to file a class action. That's how our legal system is supposed to work. But instead of doing the hard work of certifying a class under Rule 23, plaintiffs are running to these activist judges and asking for universal injunctions. Why? Because they know they can't meet the legal requirements for a class action. So they're gaming the system, and the judges are letting them. This isn't justice, this is manipulation. And let me tell you what else this leads to: forum shopping. The nominee even admitted it. Plaintiffs are filing these cases in jurisdictions where they know they'll get a favorable ruling. They're shopping around for judges who will issue these nationwide injunctions, and it's happening on both sides of the aisle. But let's be honest, this tactic has been weaponized against conservatives and against President Trump in particular. Here's a shocking statistic for you. In the entire 20th century, only 27 universal injunctions were issued. 27. But during President Trump's first term alone, 86 universal injunctions were issued against his administration. 86. And in his second term, there have already been 30 issued. Tell me that's not politically motivated. Tell me that's not an abuse of power. I dare anyone to try. Let me make this clear. These judges are not elected. They are not accountable to the people. And yet, they're making decisions that impact every single one of us. That's not democracy, folks. That's tyranny in a black robe. And the fact that these injunctions are being used as a political weapon against one administration, an administration elected by the people, is an outrage. An absolute outrage. Now, Senator Kennedy also brought up another great point, Article 3 of the Constitution. Article 3 defines judicial power. It says courts are supposed to decide cases and controversies between specific parties. It doesn't say anything about issuing orders that affect people who aren't even in the courtroom. That's because the founders didn't want judges to have that kind of power. They wanted judges to resolve disputes, not legislate from the bench. And let me tell you something else. This isn't just about President Trump. This is about the balance of power in our government. This is about protecting the Constitution. If we let this abuse of judicial power continue, what's next? Are we going to let one judge decide the outcome of every major policy issue in this country? Are we going to let the judiciary override the will of the people? Not on my watch. Folks, this is why elections matter. This is why appointing originalist judges, judges who respect the Constitution, is so important. We need judges who understand that their job is to interpret the law, not rewrite it. And we need senators like John Kennedy who aren't afraid to ask the tough questions and hold these nominees accountable. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about politics. This is about preserving the rule of law and the principles that make America great. So here's what I need you to do. Share this video. Talk to your friends and family about what's happening in our courts. And most importantly, stay informed. Because the Constitution is under attack, and it's up to us, the American people, to defend it. Thanks for watching, and may God bless America.